The scent of coal smoke and desperation hung in the air as Julia Harper's boot touched the wooden platform of Ardmore Station, Oklahoma Territory, and her knees nearly buckled beneath her traveling dress. The October wind of 1889 whipped at her bonnet strings while her trembling fingers clutched the weathered carpet bag that contained everything she owned in this world, and she wondered if she had made the greatest mistake of her life by answering that newspaper advertisement 3 months ago in Boston. The train behind her hissed and groaned, eager to continue its westward journey, and Julia forced herself to take another step forward even as her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. She had traveled nearly 2,000 miles to marry a man she had never met, exchanging letters written in careful script that promised kindness and partnership in this raw frontier town, where the land run had brought thousands of hopeful settlers just 5 months earlier. The platform beneath her feet felt unsteady, though she knew it was her own fear making the solid wood seem to shift and sway. "Miss Harper." The voice came from somewhere to her left, deep and steady as stone, cutting through the chaos of the busy station where other passengers pushed past her with their trunks and children and dreams. Julia turned toward the sound and found herself looking up at a man who seemed carved from the very landscape itself. He stood well over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders that filled out his worn leather vest, dark hair that touched his collar beneath a dusty hat, and eyes the color of strong coffee that studied her with an intensity that made her breath catch. His face was weathered from sun and wind, perhaps 30 years of life etched into the lines around his mouth, and his hands rested calmly at his sides despite the bustle surrounding them. "I am Julia Harper," she managed to say, though her voice shook as badly as her hands. "Are you Henry Quinn?" "I am." He took a step closer, and she noticed he moved with deliberate care, as though approaching a spooked horse that might bolt at any sudden movement. "You look about ready to collapse. When did you last eat?" The question surprised her into honesty. "Yesterday morning in Kansas City." "I could not manage the food at the last stop." Something flickered in his dark eyes, concern perhaps, and he reached out slowly until his calloused fingers wrapped around her elbow with surprising gentleness. The touch sent warmth through her sleeve, steadying her in a way that defied explanation, and she found herself leaning slightly into that solid presence without conscious thought. "Let me take your bag," Henry said, and his other hand carefully lifted the carpet bag from her white-knuckled grip. "The hotel is just down the street. We can talk over a proper meal." "I thought we were to be married today." Julia heard the tremor in her own voice and hated it, hated showing this weakness to a man she had known for less than 3 minutes. "Your last letter said you would arrange everything with the minister." "I did arrange it." Henry guided her down the platform steps with that same steady hand on her elbow, his touch firm enough to support but not to control. "But you just traveled halfway across the country, and you are shaking so hard I can feel it through your sleeve. The minister can wait a few hours while you catch your breath." The simple kindness of those words broke something loose in Julia's chest, and she had to blink rapidly to keep the tears at bay. In Boston, her aunt had told her repeatedly that Western men were rough and uncaring, interested only in having a woman to cook and clean and warm their beds. The letters from Henry Quinn had suggested something different, but she had been afraid to believe them fully until this moment when his actions matched his written words. Ardmore's main street stretched before them in a dusty ribbon lined with false-fronted buildings that still smelled of fresh-cut lumber. The town had sprung up almost overnight after the land run, and evidence of its newness showed everywhere from the unpainted storefronts to the surveyor's stakes still visible on empty lots. Men on horseback moved past them while wagons creaked along the rutted road, and Julia caught fragments of conversation in accents she had never heard before. Southern drawls mixing with clipped northern speech and the occasional foreign tongue. Henry led her to a two-story building with a sign proclaiming it the Territorial Hotel, and she noticed how people nodded to him as they passed, respectful greetings that he returned with quiet courtesy. He held the door open for her, and the interior offered blessed relief from the wind and dust, a small lobby with a desk and stairs leading upward. "Quinn," the clerk said, a middle-aged man with spectacles perched on his nose. "This the bride you have been expecting?" "Julia Harper, meet Tom Richards. He owns this establishment along with half the other buildings in town." Henry set her carpetbag down carefully. "Tom, Miss Harper needs a room to freshen up before the wedding, and we will take a meal in the dining room." Of course. Tom produced a key from the board behind him. "Room 6, upstairs and to the right. I will have Sarah bring up some hot water for washing." Julia found herself climbing the stairs with Henry behind her, his boots heavy on the wooden steps, and she wondered at the strangeness of this moment. In her aunt's parlor back in Boston, everything had seemed so clear. She would travel west, marry a prosperous rancher, and begin a new life far from the suffocating expectations and pitying looks that had followed her after her parents' deaths. The reality felt infinitely more complicated with this quiet man whose presence made her heart beat faster for reasons she could not quite name. The room was simple but clean, with a bed covered in a quilted spread, a washstand, and a window overlooking the street below. Henry placed her carpetbag on a chair and then turned to face her, his hat now in his hands, fingers working the brim in the first nervous gesture she had seen from him. "I know this is all strange," he said finally. "We have written letters, but that is not the same as standing in the same room, looking at each other face to face. No, it is not the same at all." Julia pulled off her bonnet and set it on the bed, then reached up to smooth her dark hair, which must look frightful after days of travel. "In your letters, you mentioned you had a ranch outside of town. How far outside?" "About 5 miles north. It is not a large spread, just 800 acres that I claimed during the run. I have been living in a dugout while I build a proper house." He paused, and she saw something uncertain cross his features. "I did not lie in my letters, Julia, but I may have been optimistic about how quickly the house would be finished. The walls are up and the roof is on, but there is still work to do on the interior." She appreciated his honesty even as anxiety tightened her stomach. "I do not expect luxury, Mr. Quinn. I grew up in modest circumstances before I went to live with my aunt." "Henry," he corrected gently. "If we are going to be married, you should call me Henry. Then you must call me Julia." She met his eyes and found herself caught by the warmth in them, a kindness that made her want to trust him despite all her fears. "May I ask you something? Anything? Why did you send for a mail-order bride? Surely there are women here in Ardmore who would have married you." She gestured toward the window. "You seem well respected in town, and you have land and prospects." Henry was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands, and Julia worried she had overstepped some boundary. But then he spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "I spent 5 years working as a ranch hand in Texas before I came north for the land run. That life does not lend itself to courting or family. When I finally got my own land, I realized I wanted more than just acres and cattle." He looked up at her. "I want a home, Julia. I want someone to share it with, someone to build something lasting alongside. The women here in town, most of them already had their eyes set on other men, or they wanted things I could not give them. Your letters spoke of wanting the same things I wanted. A simple life, honest work, a real partnership." Her heart, which had been clenched tight with fear since she stepped off the train, began to ease slightly. "I did mean what I wrote. I'm not afraid of hard work and I do not need fancy things, but I confess I am terrified of disappointing you." "You could not disappoint me by being afraid," Henry said, and he took a step closer, not touching her but near enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. "Being afraid and doing something anyway, that is courage. And you just traveled 2,000 miles alone to start a new life. That takes more courage than most people ever need to find." A knock at the door interrupted them, and Henry moved back as a young woman entered carrying a pitcher of steaming water. She had freckles across her nose and red hair tucked under a cap, and she smiled brightly at Julia. "You must be the bride everyone has been talking about," she said, setting the pitcher on the washstand. "I am Sarah Richards, Tom's daughter. Welcome to Ardmore." "Thank you." Julia returned the smile, grateful for another woman's friendliness in this strange place. "I will leave you to freshen up," Henry said, backing toward the door. "Take all the time you need. I will be in the dining room when you are ready." After he left, Sarah lingered, pouring water into the basin and pulling a towel from a shelf Julia had not noticed. "You are lucky, you know," she said conversationally. "Henry Quinn is one of the good ones. My father says he is the most honest man in the territory." "How long have you known him?" Julia unbuttoned her travel-stained jacket, grateful to have someone to talk to who was not her prospective husband. "Only since April, when the town was founded, but you learn a lot about people quickly out here. When there was that dispute over water rights between the farmers and ranchers last month, Henry was the one who worked out a compromise that satisfied everyone. And when Mrs. Patterson's husband died of fever in July, Henry made sure her crops got harvested so she would have something to live on through winter." Sarah shook her head admiringly. "He could have any woman he wanted, but he said he was waiting for someone special to arrive on the train." The words warmed Julia more than they probably should, but she tried to keep her voice level. "He seems kind and handsome and owns good land. That is a rare combination." Sarah moved toward the door. "The beef stew in the dining room is excellent today, by the way. You should eat plenty." "You are much too thin." Alone in the room, Julia washed away the grime of travel and changed into her best dress, a deep blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. Her hands still trembled slightly as she pinned her hair into a more respectable arrangement. But the trembling came from different emotions now, anticipation mixing with the fear in a way that made her pulse race. She studied her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand and saw a 22-year-old woman with dark hair, pale skin, and eyes that held shadows from the past 3 years. Her parents had died in a fire when she was 19, and her aunt had taken her in out of duty rather than love, making it clear that Julia was a burden. The mail-order bride advertisement had offered an escape, but more than that, it had offered a chance to be wanted rather than tolerated. Taking a deep breath, Julia left the room and made her way downstairs. The dining room opened off the lobby, a modest space with 6 tables covered in checked cloths. Henry sat at a corner table, his hat on the chair beside him, and he stood when he saw her, his eyes widening slightly. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and the sincerity in his voice made her cheeks warm. "Thank you." She let him hold her chair, then settled into it, acutely aware of how close he sat when he took his own seat. "I hope I did not keep you waiting long, not at all." He signaled to Sarah, who brought over 2 bowls of stew that smelled incredible, rich with beef and vegetables and herbs. "Eat," Henry said gently. "You need to get your strength back." Julia discovered she was hungrier than she had realized, and the stew tasted even better than it smelled. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Henry spoke again. "Tell me about Boston. Your letters mentioned you lived there most of your life." "I did. My father was a clerk at a shipping company, and my mother took in sewing to help make ends meet. We had a small house near the harbor. Julia took another spoonful of stew, letting the warmth settle in her stomach. After they died, my mother's sister took me in, but she made it clear I was an imposition. She had her own family to support and did not need another mouth to feed. I am sorry. Henry's hand moved across the table, and his fingers brushed hers briefly, a gesture of comfort that made her heart skip. My parents died when I was 16, cholera outbreak in Missouri. I understand what it is like to lose them. Is that when you became a ranch hand? Not right away. I tried to keep the farm going for a year, but I was too young and did not know enough. After I lost it to debt, I headed south and found work on a cattle ranch. The foreman taught me everything about raising stock and managing land. He smiled slightly. Hard lessons, but good ones. They talked through the meal, and Julia found herself relaxing in ways she had not expected. Henry asked questions that showed genuine interest in her life, her thoughts, her hopes for the future. He told her about his experiences during the land run, how he had staked his claim to a piece of land with a creek running through it and good grass for cattle. He spoke of his plans to build a herd, to plant crops, to create something permanent. I should tell you, Henry said as Sarah cleared their empty bowls, the wedding is arranged for 4 o'clock at the church. But we do not have to go through with it today if you are not ready. You could stay here at the hotel for a while, get to know the town and get to know me better before you decide. Julia looked at him across the table, this man who had shown her nothing but kindness and consideration since the moment she arrived. She thought about his letters, carefully written over the past 3 months, sharing his life and dreams with an honesty that had touched her heart. She thought about his steady presence when she stepped off the train shaking with fear, the way his hand on her elbow had grounded her. And she thought about the alternative, returning to Boston and her aunt's grudging hospitality with nowhere else to go. I am as ready as I will ever be, she said quietly. If you still want to marry me, I do. His eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. I want that very much, Julia. The church stood at the end of Main Street, a simple wooden structure with a cross mounted above the door and windows that let in the afternoon light. Henry offered his arm as they walked the short distance from the hotel, and Julia took it, feeling the solid muscle beneath his shirt sleeve and drawing strength from his steadiness. Inside, the minister waited along with Tom Richards and his wife, who had agreed to serve as witnesses. The ceremony itself was brief, traditional words spoken in the quiet space while Julia's heart hammered against her ribs. When Henry took her hand to slide a simple gold band onto her finger, his touch was warm and sure, and she found herself looking up at him with something like wonder. You may kiss your bride, the minister said, and Henry bent his head slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But Julia did not pull away. Instead, she lifted her face to his, and when his lips brushed hers, soft and careful, she felt something shift deep inside her chest, a recognition that her life had just changed in ways she could not yet fully understand. The kiss lasted only a moment before Henry pulled back, his eyes searching hers for any sign of distress. Finding none, he smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered face and made him look younger, less burdened. "Hello, wife," he said softly. "Hello, husband." The words felt strange on her tongue but not unwelcome. Tom Richards clapped Henry on the shoulder. "Congratulations, both of you. Will you stay in town tonight or are you heading out to the ranch?" Henry looked at Julia. "What would you prefer?" "We could stay at the hotel or we could go to the ranch. It is about an hour's ride and we would arrive before dark." Julia considered. The hotel room felt safe, familiar after the hours she had already spent there, but it was not their home. The ranch, whatever its condition, represented their future together, and she found herself curious to see it despite her nervousness about what the night would bring. The ranch, she decided. I would like to see our home. Henry's expression showed approval and perhaps relief. Then we will head out. I have a wagon waiting at the livery stable. They collected Julia's carpetbag from the hotel room, and Henry added a box of supplies he had stored at the general store. The wagon was a simple flatbed pulled by two sturdy horses, and Henry helped Julia up onto the bench seat before climbing up beside her. He took the reins in his capable hands, and they rolled out of Ardmore, heading north on a dirt track that stretched across the open prairie. The Oklahoma Territory spread around them in rolling grassland that turned golden in the October afternoon light. The sky arched overhead in endless blue, and Julia found herself breathing deeply, tasting the clean air that held none of Boston's smoke and crowds. The landscape felt overwhelmingly vast after the narrow streets she had known all her life, and she understood suddenly why people spoke of the West with such hunger in their voices. "It is beautiful," she said, and Henry glanced at her with pleasure. "It is. When I first saw this land back in April, I knew I wanted to make it my own. There is something about having space around you, being able to see for miles in every direction, that makes you feel free." He guided the horses around a rut in the road. "Does it frighten you being so far from town?" "A little," Julia admitted. "But cities frighten me too, just in different ways. At least out here I can see what is coming." They rode in companionable silence for a while, and Julia found herself stealing glances at her new husband. The afternoon light caught in his dark hair and cast shadows along his strong jaw, and she noticed details she had missed earlier. A small scar on his left hand, probably from ranch work. Laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than his serious demeanor might indicate. The way he held the reins with confidence but not harshness, guiding rather than forcing the horses. "Tell me about the house," she said, wanting to fill the silence with conversation. "You mentioned the walls and roof are finished. The main structure is sound." "I built it from lumber hauled from the rail station, good pine boards. There is a main room that serves as kitchen and living space, and a bedroom separated by a door. I installed a wood stove for cooking and heat, and there is a well about 20 yards from the house with good water." He paused. "What is not finished is the interior walls. They need to be chinked and plastered. The floor is just rough boards that need sanding and finishing. And the windows have shutters but no glass yet, though I ordered some from Kansas City that should arrive next week." "It sounds more than adequate," Julia said, meaning it. She had expected far worse based on stories she had heard about frontier living. "Is there furniture?" "A bed, a table with 2 chairs, and some shelves. I built them myself, so they are sturdy if not fancy." Henry looked at her seriously. "I know it is not what you are accustomed to in Boston." "My aunt's house had nice furniture," Julia said quietly, "but it never felt like home. A home is more than just things, I think." "I hope you are right." Henry's voice held a note of vulnerability that touched her. "I want you to be happy here, Julia. That matters to me more than you might think." The land began to change as they traveled, the flat prairie giving way to gentle rolls and dips. A line of trees appeared in the distance, and Henry pointed toward them. "That is Willow Creek. It runs through the property and never goes dry, even in the hottest summer. Having water on the land is the main reason I claimed this particular section." As they drew closer, Julia saw the house sitting on a rise about 100 yards from the creek. It was a simple rectangle with a pitched roof and a covered porch across the front, the wood still new enough to be pale gold in the afternoon sun. Behind it stood a barn and a corral with several horses grazing inside, and beyond that, Cattle dotted the grassland in small clusters. "That is it," Henry said, and she heard both pride and uncertainty in his voice. "What do you think?" Julia studied the scene, this place that was now her home, and felt an unexpected surge of emotion. The house looked solid despite its unfinished state, built by the hands of the man beside her. The land around it held a raw beauty that stirred something deep in her chest. And most importantly, it was theirs, a place they could shape together rather than fitting themselves into spaces others had made. "I think it is perfect," she said honestly, and the relief that washed over Henry's face made her glad she had spoken the truth. He drove the wagon up to the house and helped her down, his hands spanning her waist as he lifted her to the ground. The touch lasted a moment longer than necessary, and Julia felt heat rise in her cheeks as she stepped back. Henry retrieved her carpetbag and the supply box, then led her up the porch steps and through the door. The interior matched his description: a large main room with a wood stove in one corner, a table with chairs near it, and shelves along one wall holding dishes and supplies. The bedroom door stood open, revealing a bed covered in what looked like a new quilt, and Julia wondered if Henry had bought it specifically for her arrival. The floors were indeed rough, but clean, and the walls showed gaps that let in thin streams of light. "I know it needs work," Henry said, setting down the bags, "but it is sound, and it will keep us warm through the winter. It is fine, truly." Julia walked to the window and looked out at the view of the creek and the prairie beyond. "I can see us making this into something wonderful." Henry moved to stand beside her, not touching but close enough that she felt his warmth. "I am glad you think so. I was worried you would take one look and want to go back to Boston. Boston holds nothing for me anymore." She turned to face him, gathering her courage. "I know we are still strangers in many ways, Henry, but I meant my vows. I want to make this marriage work." His eyes searched her face, and she saw the same hope and uncertainty she felt reflected back at her. "So do I. I know this is awkward, being married to someone you just met. We can take things slowly, Julia. I am not expecting anything from you tonight except maybe help making dinner." The kindness of that statement, the way he gave her space to breathe and adjust, made Julia's eyes sting with tears of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." They prepared a simple meal together, and Julia discovered that Henry was competent in the kitchen in the way of men who had lived alone and learned to fend for themselves. He showed her where things were stored, explaining which supplies he kept on hand and which had to be purchased in town. They worked side by side, and Julia found herself relaxing into the rhythm of it, passing him a knife when he needed it, stirring the beans while he sliced bread. As darkness fell outside, Henry lit kerosene lamps that cast warm pools of light in the main room. They ate at the table, and conversation came easier now, perhaps because they were engaged in the ordinary business of living rather than the weighted formality of their earlier interactions. Henry told her about the neighboring ranchers, the challenges of breaking prairie land, his plans for expanding the herd come spring. "I was thinking," he said as they washed the dishes together, "that you might want to write to your aunt, let her know you arrived safely." "I suppose I should." Julia dried a plate and set it on the shelf. "Though I doubt she is worried, she was relieved to see me go. Even so, it is the right thing to do." Henry handed her another plate. "We can ride into town tomorrow if you want to post a letter. There are probably other things you need as well, supplies for fixing up the house or maybe fabric for curtains." The thoughtfulness of his suggestions touched her. "That would be nice. I would like to make this place feel more like home." After the dishes were done, an awkward silence fell between them. Julia was acutely aware that they were married, that the bedroom with its single bed stood just beyond that door, and that Henry had every legal and moral right to expect her in it. But he had said they could take things slowly, and she desperately hoped he meant it. "I usually turn in early since ranch work starts at dawn," Henry said, not quite meeting her eyes. "But you must be exhausted from your journey. Why do not you take the bedroom, and I will make a pallet out here by the stove?" "I cannot take your bed," Julia protested. "This is your home. It is our home now." Henry pulled blankets from a shelf and began arranging them on the floor. "And I have slept in worse places than a warm house with a wood floor. Please, Julia, let me do this for you." She wanted to argue further, but exhaustion was indeed weighing on her, the culmination of days of travel and the emotional tumult of the day catching up all at once. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. For meeting me at the train, for being patient, for being kind." Henry looked up from his makeshift bed, and in the lamplight his eyes were soft. "You do not have to thank me for that. Kindness should be the foundation of a marriage, not something to be grateful for." Julia carried her carpetbag into the bedroom and closed the door, then stood for a moment in the dim space, lit only by moonlight through the unglassed window. She changed into her nightgown with shaking hands, then climbed into the bed and pulled the quilt up to her chin. The mattress was firm but comfortable, and the quilt smelled faintly of lavender, as though Henry had stored it with sachets. She lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of Henry moving around in the main room, the soft thud of his boots as he removed them, the creak of floorboards as he settled onto his pallet. Outside, wind whispered through the grass and an owl called somewhere along the creek, sounds utterly foreign to someone raised in a city. Sleep should have come quickly given her exhaustion, but instead, Julia's mind raced with thoughts of the day, of the man sleeping on the floor in the next room because he wanted her to feel safe. She thought about his steady hands when she stepped off the train shaking, the way he had calmed her fears without even seeming to try. She thought about the future stretching before them, full of possibility and work and the slow building of something real. And she thought, just before sleep finally claimed her, that maybe she had been incredibly lucky to find Henry Quinn. Morning came with golden light streaming through the window and the smell of coffee drifting from the main room. Julia dressed quickly in a simple work dress, braided her hair, and emerged to find Henry already up, the stove hot and bacon sizzling in a pan. "Good morning," he said, glancing up with a smile. "I hope the bed was comfortable." "It was, thank you." "And you did not have to let me sleep while you did all the work." Julia moved to the stove, taking the fork from his hand. "Let me finish this. You have been taking care of me since I arrived. It is my turn." He looked like he might argue, but then nodded and stepped back. "All right. I will go check on the stock and be back in a bit." While he was gone, Julia finished making breakfast and set the table, a small act of domesticity that felt surprisingly satisfying. When Henry returned, his hair damp from washing at the well, they sat down together and Julia poured coffee into tin cups. "I was thinking," Henry said, buttering a piece of bread, "that we could take that trip to town today like I mentioned. But also I want to show you the rest of the ranch, let you get familiar with the land. Would you like that?" "Very much." Julia found herself eager to see more, to understand the scope of what they were building together. After breakfast, Henry saddled 2 horses, a tall bay gelding for himself and a smaller chestnut mare for Julia. "Her name is Rosie," he said, helping Julia mount. "She is gentle and sure-footed. Have you ridden before, a little when I was young? My father took me to a stable sometimes." Julia settled into the saddle, adjusting her skirts. The height felt precarious at first, but Rosie stood patiently while she found her balance. They rode out together, Henry keeping his bay to an easy walk so Julia could get comfortable. He showed her the boundaries of their land, pointing out landmarks and explaining his plans for different sections. Here, he wanted to plant wheat come spring. There, he would let the cattle graze in summer. Along the creek, he hoped to cultivate vegetables and maybe even plant some fruit trees if they could be coaxed to grow in the Oklahoma soil. Julia listened and watched, impressed by how thoroughly he had thought everything through. This was not a man chasing empty dreams, but someone with practical plans and the determination to see them through. And he included her in those plans, asking her opinions, wondering aloud what she thought about different ideas. "What about chickens?" Julia asked as they paused on a rise overlooking the house. "I could manage chickens and we would have eggs." "That is a fine idea." Henry grinned at her enthusiasm. "We can build a coop near the house, keep them safe from coyotes and foxes, maybe get some started before winter sets in." They rode for hours, and Julia felt her body remembering the rhythm of horseback riding, her muscles loosening as confidence grew. Henry was a patient teacher, offering advice when she needed it, but mostly letting her figure things out herself. By the time they returned to the house for lunch, she felt wind-blown and exhilarated, more alive than she had in years. The afternoon trip to Ardmore revealed more of the town than Julia had seen during her brief visit the day before. Henry took her to the general store, where she met Mr. and Mrs. Chen, Chinese immigrants who had opened the business after the land run. They welcomed her warmly and helped her select fabric for curtains, thread, needles, and various household items she wanted. "Mrs. Quinn, Mrs. Chen said with a smile, "You come back anytime. We also take orders for special items from Kansas City if you need something we do not stock." The sound of her married name still felt strange, but Julia smiled and thanked her. As they loaded the supplies into the wagon, she noticed several women watching from across the street, their expressions curious but not unfriendly. "That is the sewing circle," Henry said quietly, following her gaze. "They meet at the church on Wednesday afternoons. You might enjoy joining them once you are settled." "I would like that." Julia realized she wanted to make friends here, to become part of the community rather than remaining isolated on the ranch. They stopped at the post office, where Julia mailed her brief letter to her aunt, then at the livestock dealer, where Henry arranged to purchase 6 laying hens to be delivered the following week. Each errand revealed more of how Henry was known and respected in town, how people greeted him with genuine warmth and welcomed Julia as his wife. On the ride back to the ranch, Julia felt the weight of worry that had pressed on her chest since Boston finally beginning to lift. The future still held uncertainty, but it no longer felt like a dark chasm she was falling into. Instead, it seemed like a path she could walk with steady steps, especially with Henry beside her. That night, after another shared meal and easy conversation, Julia found herself reluctant to retreat to the bedroom alone. They had talked about so much throughout the day, learning each other's stories and preferences, and she felt closer to him than seemed possible after such a short acquaintance. "Henry," she said as he began laying out his blankets on the floor again, "you do not have to sleep out here. The bed is large enough for both of us." He froze, his hands full of blankets, and looked at her with something between hope and uncertainty. "Julia, I do not want you to feel pressured." "I do not feel pressured. I feel foolish for taking your bed when we are married." She felt her cheeks heat but forced herself to continue. "We do not have to, we could just sleep, but it seems silly for you to be uncomfortable when there is a perfectly good bed." Henry set down the blankets slowly. "If you are sure, I am sure." They prepared for bed in awkward silence, Henry stepping outside to give Julia privacy to change into her nightgown. When he came back in and entered the bedroom, she was already under the covers, her heart racing but her resolve firm. This was her husband, and she wanted to begin truly being married to him, even if they started with small steps. Henry changed quickly, blowing out the lamp before climbing into the other side of the bed. The mattress dipped under his weight, and Julia felt the warmth of his body even though several inches separated them. They lay in the darkness, neither speaking, and Julia could hear his breathing, slow and steady. "Thank you," Henry said finally, his voice soft in the darkness, "for trusting me. Thank you for being trustworthy." Julia turned onto her side, facing toward him even though she could barely see him in the dark. "I never expected this, you know. When I answered your advertisement, I hoped for kindness, but I did not expect to actually like you." She heard him chuckle, a low, warm sound. "I feel the same. Your letters showed intelligence and humor, but I worried that the reality would not match. I am glad to be wrong." They talked in the darkness, voices hushed as though loud sounds might break the fragile intimacy of the moment. Henry told her about his dreams for the ranch, his hope to build something lasting that might be passed down to children someday. Julia spoke of her love for books, how she had worked at a lending library in Boston before her aunt decided it was unseemly for a woman to work outside the home. "You could start a lending library here," Henry suggested. "Bring some culture to the frontier. Do you think people would use it?" The idea sparked excitement in Julia's chest. "I think people hunger for books and learning as much as anything else. It is a fine idea, Julia. We could order books through the Chens, build up a collection slowly." As the conversation drifted into comfortable silence, Julia felt herself relaxing completely for the first time since leaving Boston. The bed felt warm and safe, Henry's presence beside her solid and reassuring rather than threatening. When sleep came, it was deep and dreamless. The next morning, Julia woke to find Henry already gone, though she could hear him moving around outside. She dressed and went to make breakfast, falling into what was quickly becoming a routine. When Henry came in from feeding the horses, they ate together, and afterward, Julia retrieved the fabric and sewing supplies from the wagon. "I am going to mend the gaps in the walls today," Henry said, gathering tools. "It will get dusty and noisy. You might want to work on your curtains outside where the light is better." Julia set herself up on the porch with her sewing basket, and they worked through the morning in companionable proximity. Henry inside chinking the walls with clay and Julia stitching neat hems into the blue fabric she had chosen. Occasionally, Henry would come out to get more supplies, and they would exchange a few words, checking on each other's progress. By midday, Julia had finished one set of curtains, and Henry had completed 2 walls. They ate lunch together, then returned to their tasks, and Julia marveled at how natural it all felt, this working side by side toward common goals. In Boston, she had been idle most days, her aunt considering it improper for her to do much beyond needlework and reading. Here, her hands were busy and her mind engaged, and she felt useful in ways she never had before. That evening they hung her finished curtains in the bedroom, and the transformation was immediate. The simple fabric softened the rough space, making it feel more finished, more like a home. Julia stood back to admire them, and Henry came up beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. "You did beautiful work," he said. "They make the room look completely different." "It is starting to feel like ours," Julia replied, and when she looked up at him, she saw warmth in his eyes that made her pulse quicken. "Yes," Henry agreed quietly. "It is." The days that followed fell into a rhythm that Julia found deeply satisfying. She woke early to make breakfast while Henry tended the livestock. They worked through the mornings on various projects, Julia sewing more curtains and beginning to whitewash the interior walls while Henry built a chicken coop and mended fences. They ate lunch together, often outdoors if the weather was fine, then returned to work until evening. The nights they spent talking, sometimes at the table over coffee and sometimes in bed in the darkness, learning each other's hearts as well as their histories. Julia discovered that Henry had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he was comfortable, that he loved music, though he could not carry a tune, and that he worried constantly about doing right by her. He learned that she had a fierce intelligence that had been stifled in Boston, a love of nature that urban life had given little outlet for, and a deep loyalty once her trust was earned. And slowly, carefully, they began to bridge the physical distance between them. A hand resting on a shoulder while looking over a project together, fingers brushing as they passed dishes during meals, sitting closer together on the porch in the evenings. Until one night, a week after Julia's arrival, she found herself curled against Henry's side in bed, his arm around her shoulders, feeling safe and cherished in ways she had never imagined possible. "I am falling in love with you," Henry said into the darkness, his voice barely above a whisper. "I did not expect it to happen so quickly, but I cannot help it." Julia's heart felt like it might burst. "I am falling in love with you too, every day a little more." His arms tightened around her, and she tilted her face up, searching for his in the darkness. When their lips met, it was nothing like the chaste kiss at their wedding. This kiss held tenderness and growing passion, a promise of what might be between them. Julia felt herself responding, her hands coming up to rest against his chest where she could feel his heart beating hard and fast. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing heavily, Henry rested his forehead against hers. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion and desire. "I am sure," Julia whispered. "I want this. I want you." What followed was tender and careful, Henry taking his time to make sure of her comfort and pleasure, Julia giving herself to him with trust and growing joy. There was awkwardness too, the natural fumbling of two people learning each other's bodies, but underneath, it ran a current of deep affection that transformed the physical act into something profound. Afterward, they lay tangled together and Julia felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were tears of relief and happiness rather than sorrow. Henry kissed them away gently, holding her close as their breathing slowly returned to normal. "Thank you," she whispered, "for being patient with me, for giving me time to be ready." "Always," Henry promised. "I will always be patient with you, Julia. You are the most precious thing in my life." The weeks that followed deepened their bond until Julia could hardly remember a time when Henry had not been at the center of her world. October gave way to November, and the prairie grass turned brown while the wind carried the bite of approaching winter. They worked together to prepare the ranch, stacking firewood, checking that the barn was secure, making sure the livestock had adequate shelter. The chickens arrived and took up residence in their new coop, providing fresh eggs that Julia gathered each morning. She began baking bread regularly, the scent filling the house with warmth and comfort. Henry praised her cooking effusively, though Julia suspected he would have praised anything she made, even when she burned the biscuits or oversalted the stew. On Sundays, they rode into Ardmore for church services, and Julia began to make friends among the other women. She joined the Wednesday sewing circle, bringing mending work and contributing to the quilts they were making for families in need. The women welcomed her warmly, curious about her life in Boston but more interested in who she was becoming in Oklahoma. "You look happy," Sarah Richards commented one Wednesday as they worked side by side on a quilt square. "Marriage to Henry Quinn suits you." "It does," Julia agreed, unable to keep the smile from her face. "More than I ever imagined it could. You are lucky to have found each other." Sarah nodded her thread. "True partnership is rare, but you two seem to have it." Julia thought about that conversation as she rode home that evening, Henry beside her on the wagon bench. Partnership was exactly what they had, she realized. Not a marriage where one person commanded and the other obeyed, but a true joining of equals working toward shared goals. Henry valued her opinions, sought her input on decisions, and made sure she felt heard and respected. In turn, Julia gave him her full support and effort, working as hard as he did to make their ranch prosper. Winter settled over the prairie in earnest as December arrived, bringing snow that transformed the landscape into something magical. The house stayed warm thanks to the wood stove and the careful work they had done sealing gaps in the walls. Julia hung evergreen branches in the windows for Christmas, and Henry surprised her with a small tree he had cut along the creek. "I know it is not much," he said, carrying it into the house. "But I wanted you to have something festive. It is perfect." Julia's eyes stung with happy tears as she decorated it with paper ornaments she had made and strings of dried berries. On Christmas morning, they exchanged modest gifts. Julia gave Henry a warm scarf she had knitted in secret, and he presented her with a leather-bound journal and pen set. "For starting your lending library," he said. "You can keep track of books and who borrows them. This is wonderful." Julia threw her arms around his neck, kissing him soundly. "Thank you, Henry. Thank you for believing in my ideas." They made love that morning with the snow falling outside and the Christmas tree glowing in the corner, and Julia felt so full of love and contentment that she thought she might float away. This life they were building together exceeded every hope she had carried west on that train. The new year of 1890 brought fresh challenges and opportunities. In January, word came that Oklahoma Territory would likely achieve statehood within a few years, bringing more stability and growth to the region. Henry and Julia discussed expanding their operations, perhaps buying more cattle or trying their hand at horse breeding. "Whatever we do, we will decide together," Henry insisted, and Julia loved him even more for that. February brought a blizzard that trapped them inside for 3 days, but Julia found she did not mind being snowbound when it meant more time with Henry. They talked and read aloud to each other and made love while the wind howled outside, and Julia thought she had never been happier in her life. When March arrived with the first hints of spring, Julia realized she had missed her monthly courses. She said nothing at first, not wanting to raise hopes prematurely, but when another month passed with the same result, she knew she had to tell Henry. She chose an evening when they sat on the porch watching the sunset, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. "Henry, I have something to tell you." "What is it?" His voice rumbled under her ear. "I am carrying a child, our child." She felt him go still, then his arms tightened around her almost painfully. "Truly, you are certain as I can be without seeing a doctor." "I have missed 2 months now, and I have been feeling sick in the mornings." Julia pulled back to look at his face and saw tears streaming down his cheeks. "Henry, are you all right?" "I am more than all right. I am overwhelmed." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away happy tears she had not realized she was crying too. "Julia, you have given me everything. A home, a partnership, love, and now a child. I do not have words for what this means to me. It means everything to me too." She kissed him softly. "We are going to be a family, Henry. A real family." The next months passed in a blur of preparation and growing anticipation. Henry became even more protective, insisting Julia rest more and work less, though she laughed and told him pregnancy was not an illness. They converted a corner of the bedroom into a nursery, Henry building a beautiful cradle from oak wood while Julia sewed tiny gowns and blankets. The women from the sewing circle threw her a celebration, presenting her with an enormous pile of baby clothes and supplies they had secretly been making for weeks. Julia was moved to tears by their generosity and the warmth of the community she had found in this frontier town. "You are one of us now," Mrs. Chen said, patting Julia's hand, "and we take care of our own." Summer arrived hot and bright, and Julia grew round with the child she carried. Henry would place his hands on her swollen belly at night, feeling the baby kick, his face full of wonder. They talked about names and argued good-naturedly about whether it would be a boy or girl, though both agreed they would be happy either way as long as the child was healthy. In late August, on a sweltering afternoon that made even breathing feel like work, Julia's labor began. Henry rode into town at breakneck speed to fetch the midwife, Mrs. Patterson, the widow he had once helped with her harvest. She arrived calm and capable, taking charge of the situation with practiced efficiency. The labor lasted through the night and into the next day, and there were moments when Julia wondered if she had the strength to continue. But Henry stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, whispering encouragement and love. His steady presence gave her strength when her own faltered, just as it had that first day when she stepped off the train shaking with fear. Finally, as the sun climbed toward noon on that second day, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that announced his arrival to anyone within hearing distance. Mrs. Patterson cleaned and wrapped him, then placed him in Julia's arms, and Julia looked down at the tiny face and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. "He is perfect," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Henry, look at him. He is perfect." Henry bent over them both, his own face wet with tears, and kissed Julia's forehead and then their son's. "You are amazing. You are both amazing." His voice broke. "Thank you, Julia. Thank you for this gift." They named him Thomas Henry Quinn, after Henry's father and Tom Richards, who had become a good friend. Little Thomas had dark hair like his father and his mother's blue eyes, and he quickly became the center of their world. The first months of parenthood were exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. Thomas was a good baby but still demanded constant attention, and Julia discovered depths of tiredness she had not known existed. But Henry stepped in to help without being asked, walking Thomas when he cried at night, changing soiled cloths without complaint, and handling ranch work during the day so Julia could rest when the baby slept. "We are partners," he said when Julia tried to thank him for the 100th time. "That means we share everything, good and bad, easy and hard. You carried him for 9 months and went through hell to bring him into the world. The least I can do is lose some sleep." Julia fell even more deeply in love with him watching him with their son. Henry was tender and careful, singing off-key lullabies and making silly faces that got Thomas smiling early. He built a larger table so Thomas's cradle could sit near them during meals, wanting his son included in family life from the beginning. The seasons turned again, and Thomas grew from a tiny infant into a chubby baby who laughed and reached for everything. The ranch prospered under Henry's careful management, the herd growing, the crops producing well. Julia's small lending library became a reality, with a dedicated shelf in the main room holding 24 books that neighbors could borrow. She kept meticulous records in the journal Henry had given her, and the lending library became a point of pride for the community. When Thomas was 18 months old, Julia discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy felt easier somehow, perhaps because she knew what to expect or perhaps because Thomas was old enough to be less demanding. Their daughter arrived on a spring morning in 1892, squalling indignantly at the world, and they named her Catherine after Julia's mother. 2 children, Henry marveled, holding Catherine while Thomas toddled around their feet demanding attention. "We are truly blessed, Julia." "We are," she agreed, watching her family with a contentment that suffused every part of her being. The years flowed past like the creek that ran through their property, steady and life-giving. Thomas grew into a sturdy boy who followed his father everywhere, learning ranch work almost before he could properly walk. Catherine proved to be fiery and independent, insisting on doing everything her older brother did, and usually succeeding through sheer determination. In 1895, Julia gave birth to their third child, another boy they named Samuel. He was sweet-natured and thoughtful, more likely to be found with a book than a rope, and Julia saw echoes of herself in him. Henry built an addition onto the house, expanding it to accommodate their growing family, and Julia planted a garden that flourished under her care. Oklahoma achieved statehood in 1907, and by then, the Quinn Ranch had become one of the most successful in the county. But more important to Julia than material success was the life they had built together. Their children were healthy and happy, growing up knowing they were loved and valued. The ranch ran smoothly because she and Henry worked as a team, respecting each other's strengths and supporting each other's weaknesses. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Henry and Julia stood on the porch of their expanded house, watching the sun set over land they had transformed from raw prairie into productive ranch. Thomas, now 16, was out checking fences. Catherine, 13, was practicing piano inside, the slightly off-tune notes drifting through the windows. Samuel, 10, sat under a tree reading one of the many books that now filled several shelves in what had become the Quinn family lending library. "You ever regret it?" Henry asked, his arm around Julia's waist. "Leaving Boston to marry a stranger." Julia turned to look at her husband, this man who had met her when she stepped off the train shaking with fear, and had calmed those fears with his steady presence. Gray touched his temples now, and lines marked his face, but his eyes still held the same warmth and kindness that had drawn her to him from the beginning. "Not for a single moment," she said honestly. "That train brought me to everything I never knew I wanted. It brought me home." Henry pulled her close and kissed her with the same tenderness he had shown on their wedding day and every day since. "You brought me home too," he said softly. "I built this house, but you made it a home. You made everything better, Julia. Everything." As darkness fell over the Oklahoma prairie, the Quinn family gathered inside for dinner. They sat around the large table Henry had built years ago, now expanded to accommodate 5 people, and shared the day's events. Thomas talked about finding a section of fence that needed repair. Catherine complained about her piano teacher's strictness. Samuel asked if they could order a new book he had heard about. Julia listened to her children and looked at her husband, and her heart overflowed with gratitude for the life she had found in this wild place. She thought about the terrified young woman who had stepped off that train 15 years ago, shaking with uncertainty about the future, and wished she could tell that woman that everything would be more than all right. That the cowboy with steady hands would not just calm her fears, but would give her a life beyond her wildest dreams. After dinner, after the children were tucked into bed, Julia and Henry retreated to their bedroom, the same room where they had first tentatively shared a bed on their wedding night. The blue curtains Julia had sewn that first week still hung at the windows, faded now but still serviceable, a reminder of where they had started. They made love with the ease and intimacy of long familiarity, knowing exactly how to please each other, their bodies fitting together as perfectly as their lives had. Afterward, Henry held her close, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "I love you," he said, words he spoke often but never casually. More every day somehow. I love you too. Julia kissed his chest, right over his heart. Thank you for being exactly who you promised to be in your letters. Thank you for being my partner and my love. Thank you for taking a chance on a stranger with a half-built house and big dreams. Henry's arms tightened around her. You made all those dreams come true, Julia. They drifted toward sleep in each other's arms, secure in their love and in the life they had built together. Outside, the Oklahoma wind whispered through the grass, and stars wheeled overhead in the vast prairie sky. The ranch lay quiet around them, solid and prosperous, a testament to hard work and shared vision. But more than the ranch, more than the land or cattle or even their children, the greatest thing Henry and Julia had built was the love between them. It had started with letters and hope, grown through kindness and patience, and deepened into something unshakable. From that terrifying moment when Julia stepped off the train to this peaceful night 15 years later, their love had been the steady foundation on which everything else was built. And it would continue, Julia knew, through whatever years remained to them. They would face challenges and changes, losses and gains, but they would face them together. Henry's steady hands would calm her fears, and her fierce loyalty would support his dreams. Their children would grow and leave to build lives of their own, but the love between their parents would remain constant. As sleep claimed her, Julia's last conscious thought was one of profound gratitude. The train that had brought her west had carried her to more than just a new place. It had carried her to her destiny, to the man who would be her partner in all things, to the life she was meant to live in the darkness. Henry's breathing slowed into the rhythm of sleep, and Julia matched hers to his, two hearts beating in synchrony. Tomorrow would bring new work and new joys, but for now, there was only this: the warmth of their bed, the comfort of their home, and the deep peace of knowing they were exactly where they belonged. The Wild West had seemed frightening when Julia first arrived, vast and untamed and full of unknown dangers. But she had discovered that with the right person beside her, even the wildest places could become home. Love had tamed her fears without diminishing her courage, and she had grown from a frightened girl into a strong woman who could face anything. Years continued to pass in their steady rhythm. Thomas married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread in 1899, and by 1901, Henry and Julia were grandparents to a little girl named Lucy. Catherine proved too independent for marriage until she was 25, when she met a schoolteacher from Guthrie who appreciated her fierce intelligence and matched her in spirited debate. They married in 1904, and Catherine continued teaching alongside her husband, breaking conventions but earning respect. Samuel, true to his thoughtful nature, went east to attend university in 1903, studying literature and history. He returned in 1908 with a degree and a bride, a quiet young woman who loved books as much as he did. Together, they expanded the Quinn Lending Library into a proper town library, with Samuel serving as librarian and his wife as his assistant. Henry and Julia grew older together, their bodies slowing but their love never diminishing. On cold winter nights, they sat by the fire and reminisced about their years together, laughing over early mishaps and marveling at how quickly time had passed. Henry's hair went fully gray, and Julia's face gained lines, but when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people who had taken a chance on marriage to a stranger. In the spring of 1920, they celebrated their 30th anniversary with all 3 children, their spouses, and 7 grandchildren gathered at the ranch. The house had been expanded again to accommodate large gatherings, and Julia's garden had matured into something spectacular, with roses climbing trellises and vegetables growing in neat rows. As the family sat down to dinner, Thomas raised his glass in a toast. To my parents, who showed all of us what real love looks like. You built more than a ranch here. You built a legacy of partnership and devotion that we all aspire to. Everyone raised their glasses, and Julia felt tears prick her eyes. She looked at Henry and saw him struggling with emotion as well. Their gamble on a mail-order marriage had paid off beyond anything either could have imagined, not just in personal happiness, but in the family they had created and the values they had passed down. That night, alone in their bedroom after everyone had gone to sleep, Henry and Julia lay in bed talking as they had done for 3 decades. "You remember the first night we shared this bed?" Julia asked, her head on his shoulder. "How nervous we both were." "I remember everything about our early days." Henry's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with practiced ease. "I remember seeing you on that train platform, shaking so hard I thought you might collapse. I remember thinking I had to find a way to make you feel safe." "You did make me feel safe. From that very first moment when you took my arm, you made me feel like maybe everything would be all right." Julia squeezed his hand. "And you have continued making me feel safe every day since." "You made me feel needed," Henry said softly. "Before you came, I had land and cattle and plans, but I did not have purpose beyond survival and accumulation. You gave me something to work for beyond myself. You made me want to be the best man I could be." They fell silent, comfortable in the quiet, secure in their love. 3 decades of marriage had brought them children and grandchildren, prosperity and community respect, but those were byproducts of the real accomplishment. The real accomplishment was this: the deep, abiding love that had grown from tentative beginnings into something unshakable. Julia thought about the girl she had been, stepping off that train in terror, and felt profound compassion for her younger self. That girl could never have imagined the life waiting for her, could never have believed that the tall cowboy with steady hands would become the center of her world. But he had, and she had become the center of his, and together they had built something beautiful. Sleep came easily these days, their bodies tired from years of hard work, but their souls at peace. As Julia drifted off, she heard Henry whisper, "I love you, Julia Quinn," and she smiled in the darkness. "I love you too, Henry Quinn," she whispered back, "forever and always." And in the ranch house they had built together, surrounded by the land they had tamed and the family they had raised, Henry and Julia slept peacefully, their love as steady and sure as it had been from that first day when a cowboy's steady hands had calmed a frightened bride's fears. The years continued their march, bringing both joy and sorrow as years inevitably do. Henry and Julia faced losses as friends passed away, and faced celebrations as grandchildren grew and married, bringing great-grandchildren into the world. Through it all, they remained partners, facing each challenge together and celebrating each victory side by side. In 1925, on a warm June evening, Henry and Julia sat on the porch as they had done thousands of times before. Henry was 70 now, and Julia was 68, their bodies marked by age but their minds still sharp and their love still strong. They watched the sun set over the prairie they had called home for 36 years, the land golden in the evening light. "It has been a good life," Henry said, his hand finding Julia's as naturally as breathing. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." "The best life," Julia agreed. "I would not change a single thing." And as darkness fell over the Oklahoma prairie, wrapping the Quinn ranch in velvet shadows, 2 people who had started as strangers sat together in perfect contentment. The mail-order bride who had stepped off the train shaking with fear had found courage in a cowboy's steady hands. And the lonely rancher who had sent for a wife had found love beyond measure. Their story was not one of grand adventure or dramatic rescues. It was quieter than that, built on daily choices to be kind, to be patient, to work together toward shared dreams. It was a story of two people who took a chance on each other and spent a lifetime proving that choice right. As the stars emerged overhead, Henry and Julia remained on the porch, holding hands and watching the night sky. They did not need words anymore. After 36 years, they could communicate in silence, their hearts beating in synchrony, their souls intertwined beyond separation. This was their happily ever after, not a fairy tale ending but something better. Real love, tested by time and trials, strengthened through partnership and patience, deepened by decades of choosing each other every single day. The Wild West had brought them together, and together they had tamed it, not through violence or domination but through love and hard work and unwavering commitment to each other. And when they finally rose from the porch and went inside, moving slowly but moving together, it was with the bone-deep satisfaction of a life well lived and a love that would endure beyond even death itself. For love like theirs was not bound by time or circumstance. It was eternal, unshakable, and absolutely real. The end of their story was not an ending at all, but rather a culmination of everything that had begun when a frightened young woman stepped off a train and found herself caught by a cowboy's steady hands and steadier heart. Everything they had built, everything they had loved, everything they had been to each other, all of it continued in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried forward the legacy of Henry and Julia Quinn. And on quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the Oklahoma prairie grass, some said you could still feel it, the love that had transformed a mail-order arrangement into a romance for the ages, the devotion that had turned a half-built ranch house into a home, the partnership that had shown everyone who knew them what marriage could be at its very best. Their love story ended not with drama, but with peace. Not with fireworks, but with the quiet contentment of two souls who had found exactly what they were looking for in each other. And that, Julia thought as she lay in Henry's arms that night and every night, was the truest form of happily ever after there could ever be.